Hello, I'm Dr. Jesvir Mahil, and I am the Director of University for Life. And this is the second year that we've hosted the Creativity and Culture Conference. One of the topics that came up as I was doing the interviews, I conducted 80 interviews this year compared with 30 last year. And during one of my interviews, somebody asked me what my story was, and it wasn't the right time and place to be recounting my story at that point in time, but I promised that I would share it at a later date. So this video is an attempt for me to just trace back the story of the conference, why I decided to take action on the idea that I had for this conference and how it's emerged and where we are at the moment. So first of all, let me start with the beginning. Stories are so deeply influential in our lives, and I'm sure that you can probably think back to your childhood, the stories that you were told by your family through your education, the stories that you read. All of those stories remain with us and they influence us in some sort of very personal way. And I remember the stories that I was told as a child, where I grew up in the Punjab. Well, until the age of 6, I was a child, and my early childhood years were in the Punjab. And I remember with fondness sitting around an open fire after we'd had evening dinner with my family, listening to stories told by my mother, by my uncles. And those stories, even though they were simple in structure, they were profound in terms of meaning. And the reason I talk about those childhood stories is that during my adult life, when I've attended conferences, some of the best conferences that I've attended have been those where there was a lot of focus on the storytelling, and the atmosphere that was created at the conference reminded me in a way of like sitting around the fire, listening to these stories that were at an unconscious level having a very deep impact. So one of the conferences that I went to was in California, and I had traveled thousands of miles. It was a wonderful place to be, but being in a hotel room indoors for more than 2 days, I didn't think that was a very good use of my time. So I love the atmosphere around conferences, but naturally I wanted to overcome all these difficulties, all these challenges that I had to face in order to find myself immersed in that kind of atmosphere, which recreated sitting around a log fire with my family, listening to stories that were deep and meaningful and that inspired me. So I wanted to recreate that experience, but without having to travel thousands of miles, paying a lot of money to stay at very expensive hotels because everyone else at the conference stayed in expensive hotels. Then you feel obliged to stay where everyone else is staying. So I wanted to cut out the expense, the distance and the inconvenience, because sometimes during my career as a teacher, I taught for well over 3 decades. I taught for about 35 years. And during those 35 years, I can count the number of conferences that I was allowed to attend on one hand, because it was usually the managers that went to the conferences, not the teachers. We were expected to stay behind and teach the classes, which couldn't be covered. That was their justification, that managers could do their work when their work was not going to be interfered with if they attended the conferences, whereas those of us who were teaching, we couldn't leave our classes. So I only went to conferences when I worked at very good organizations, and some of the top organizations in London, I wasn't allowed to go to conferences. So there was the inconvenience factor that I wanted to overcome as well. So I knew that doing an online conference, which was flexible, meant that teachers like myself wouldn't need to seek permission from their managers to attend the conference. It's provided free of charge. So there's no again, that was another factor which created a barrier for teachers like myself to attend conferences, because they were often considered to be too expensive. You know, the organisation couldn't afford to pay those fees, and they couldn't afford to let us have the time off. So it's provided free of charge to make it accessible to those who need to be engaging in this discourse the most: teachers, practicing teachers, educators. And so that was how the idea for the conference started. Last year we had 30 people involved. I interviewed 24 of them, and 6 of them actually did longer presentations. And this year I've interviewed 80 academics, entrepreneurs and educators. And the reason I think that recording these interviews would not have been possible without the technology such as Zoom, such as the emails that LinkedIn, for example, has provided an excellent social media platform, so that I've been able to connect with the 80 people involved with ease, without the challenge of having to write 80 separate emails. I've been able to send group emails, for example. That's really enabled me to put on this conference. So the story so far is that there is a growing number of people that are involved. In over 100 people have participated in the conference actively, through the interviews, through the presentations. If I count the 80 from this year plus the 30 from last year, that's over 100. There's very little overlap between those who participated last year and those who've participated this year. Next year I will see how that pattern emerges, whether every year it's going to be a new cohort of people, or whether those who were active in it last year will re-emerge in the third year. Time will tell. The reason that I think it's important to record this whole process, and the fact that the digital technology is enabling us to do this with so much convenience, is that when I look back to those stories that I was told around the fire when I was less than 6 years old, I wish that I had been able to record those stories so that I could listen back to them now, because they would have new meanings for me now as an adult, compared with when I heard those stories being told by my family more than 50 years ago. And the same is true from the conferences. So often I've been to conferences where I've been very inspired by stories that were told or facts that were shared, but a month down the line, I've forgotten what those stories were, and I've forgotten what those facts were. You know, and I'm sure that I'm not alone in this kind of inability to contain all that information and to synthesize the information the way I'd like to through my memory. So digital technology will enable us to go back to these stories at a point in the future when we will be able to reconstruct them to create new meanings. And having a video record the digital version of the interviews means that new patterns can emerge. We can listen to the same piece of information and make different connections between what else was said. That's so often lacking when we go to conferences, is that people seem to be working in silos. They know so much about their own subject, but so little about the subject of others. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to build bridges between academics, entrepreneurs, and not only between academics, entrepreneurs and educators, but between academics and other academics, because this silo style of working is prevalent in all domains of academia, that as far as I can tell. It's just nowadays there is a growing emphasis on being multidisciplinary and in building these bridges, and also in engaging with the public. with our academic research, whereas in the past it was very much highly specialized theories without making the appropriate links to others. Sometimes I've been to conferences where people have come and delivered their own lecture and then walked away again. And I found that to be very disrespectful, disappointing, a little bit frustrating, because it demonstrates that, you know, such individuals are, because they're so engrossed in their own research and they're engrossed in just communicating in a unidirectional way about their own research, they're not willing to accept feedback and to engage in multi-directional communication about their research. So that's another thing that I'm doing with the conference is trying to shift the culture so that we're not just trying to convey or disseminate our research in a one-way direction, that it's a unidirectional way, that we're allowing others to influence our research as much as we want our research to influence others. So the story so far regarding the conference and the digital stories that are being created here are that we are empowering people to be empowered to share their own voice, rather than waiting for someone else to recognize that what they have to offer is of value. It's a platform where people are allowed to speak for themselves. People are allowed to tell their own stories rather than waiting for others to tell their stories. And this leads me to the research that I'm currently doing myself. I'm very much involved in creating photo stories. I believe that photo stories are an excellent way for people to write their own histories. Very often people don't write their histories because they don't feel that they have the writing skills or the time that is required to write their family histories. Whereas most people take photographs, and what I'm doing is helping people to put their photographs together to create photo stories of their family, you know, to create family stories. Very often people want to know their family history, their lineage. We have programs, several programs on TV where celebrities are exploring their lineage, their family history. And this is through creating our photo stories. It's a way of recreating and creating and putting together the jigsaws of our own family stories, not as a linear kind of patriarchal lineage of how we've descended, but as stories. You know, I find that when we look at family trees tend to be very linear, and they can isolate those who don't marry or who don't have children of their own. Whereas in a family story, everyone's involved. In a family story, everyone, regardless of whether they are married or whether they have children, they still have a family, they have a story in which they belong. So it's a new way of looking at our families as a whole, rather than a fragment, rather than a nuclear mother, father, children, rather than nuclear stories which can become isolated from or fragmented from the rest. It's about, through these photo stories, is seeing ourselves within this wider jigsaw, seeing ourselves through the kaleidoscope, that we have a place, a position in a story rather than in a tree. So that's my research currently at the moment in creativity, is about the impact of family stories. And what I've noticed over the past few months that I've been doing the academic research for it is that there is very little that has been written about the use of photographs to create family stories as a way of transferring culture from one generation to another. So I will keep you posted through the monthly follow-up sessions, which will take place every Saturday, not every Saturday, the third Saturday of every month at 9 a.m., 2 p.m. and 10 p.m. London time. And we will share our own stories about the research that we're currently doing, and, you know, just really sharpening our sense of understanding about what we mean by this concept called creativity.